Let's turn to a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism. My name is Ariel, ben-Lyman, HaNaviy. Let's take this last 30 minutes in our hour-and-a-half long study to deal with an apologetics section where we take the Trinitarian view of Scripture and we compare and contrast it against the non-Trinitarian Christian denominational view known as biblical Unitarian. We're borrowing their web resource at biblicalunitarian.com. I myself use the label Trinitarian, although I know there's a lot of baggage with that term, and the term itself isn't found in the Bible, and trying to describe God as a tripersonal God is a daunting task. I realize that, but to the best of my ability, I believe the Bible and the Trinitarian perspective, or Trinity, or triune God, or one God, three persons, is the best description, even though the labels aren't very accurate, but it's the best description of the information that we are dealing with in the Bible. It's not a perfect description, in my opinion. Our man-made descriptions of God are always going to fall drastically short of describing God in all of his fullness and all of his majesty and glory. We're just going to have to wait till we encounter him one day and we're able to see him for who he truly is. But for now, we're having this discussion. And biblical Unitarian has taken it upon themselves to take verses in the Old Testament and New and recast them in a biblical Unitarian perspective. They're saying, hey, the Bible is a monotheistic book about one God, and his name is Yahweh, and he is the father of Jesus, the human being. And therefore, the Holy Spirit steps into the picture to complete these three main characters. Even though there's one God, there's the Holy Spirit who's also God, just a description of God's power and anointing and his interaction with humans on earth. It's impersonal in that regard, but it's personal in the sense that God is a person. But there's only one person. That's biblical Unitarian's perspective. The opposing view, the second ongoing debate, the Trinitarian perspective says, or the tripersonal perspective says, there is one being known as God, and yet his power is the same for all three of the persons. We're using the word persons there for lack of a better choice of words. We have distinctions, but we have unity. And so we're not talking about three masks. That's modalism or Sabellianism. We're not talking about that. We are talking about one God who is nevertheless three persons, three unique and separate something's persons. So language is just failing us, but we know that Jesus is a human being as well, and that's the part that makes Trinity or triune topics such as this so difficult to have with people who are non-Trinitarian or biblical Unitarian or something like that. They're really just stuck on the humanity of Jesus and can't really see that God incarnated himself and became a human being. So let's turn to the one verse that we're looking at tonight. We are going to finish this study tonight. I'm committed to finishing this because I really feel that we've done, at least for my part, I've done all that I can to demonstrate my view and my perspective. And at some point in time, the debater has to yield the microphone either to the opposing view, or the moderator has to shut the thing down and say, okay, audience, you've seen both perspectives, now cast your vote. So that's kind of where I'm going. I'm wrapping it up for the sake of trying to put a bow on it and bring some closure to the discussion. So let's read some of the relevant references first. Isaiah 9:6, Trinitarian's perspective can be seen in, I'm going to read this one first this time. Isaiah 9:6 in your average Christian Bible that you're going to pick up from any evangelical resource or Catholic resource or Lutheran or Protestant or all those primary outfits. For a child will be born to us. This just happens to be NASB. A child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. So that's the standard Christian reading that most of us in church circles are familiar with. Unless you were actually born and raised non-Trinitarian, then maybe this isn't the version you're used to. The Hebrew on the right side says, Ki yeled yulad lanu ben nitan lanu Vathi hamisra al shichmo, vayikra shmo pele yoetz el gibor aviad sadar shalom. And we talked about how that in the past, there's every reason to read the labels, the names of the child. There's every good reason to read those labels as referring to a deified figure, yet at the same time, we can understand that the characteristics of this deified figure can also apply to a human being. There's enough ambiguity or equivocation on some of the phrases that we're going to read about tonight, some of the terms, the Hebrew terms, that allow for both applications. In fact, when we go over to Biblical Unitarian's rendering, we see this is from the REV, the Revised English Version, which is available online at revisedenglishversion.com. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will call his name Wonderful Counselor, Mighty Hero, Father of the Coming Age, Prince of Peace. Notice that two of the names that are normally associated as deity, the two inner ones, the Mighty Hero and the Father of the Coming Age, those two have been rendered in a way that are basically applicable to a human being. A mighty hero, a human being. Yeah, no problem. Father of the Coming Age. When we're talking about Jesus, we're talking about the Messianic age. And he's called the Father because he's the architect. He's the one that without him is not possible. He earns that right to be called the Father, the ancestor, right? The arche in the Greek, the source of the coming Messianic age. So the theology is rock solid, and I absolutely agree with it. Without Jesus, there is no coming, from the perspective of Isaiah, no coming Messianic age. There's no future Messianic age to be had in Israel's history. We know this is the case, so the theology here is great. But do we have to take the title away from a deified Messiah and strip him down to being a human being only? No, we don't have to do that. Let's go over to the discussions that we're going to have. What I'm borrowing tonight, and for our conclusion, are two blogs. I think I can read both of these in the 20 minutes I have allotted to me. The first one is by Jonathan McClatchy, and he has a blog entitled at his website at Jonathan McClatchy, McClatchie, McClatchy, I believe. He has a Jonathan McClatchy. His name is a tongue twister. JonathanMcClatchy.com. That's his website. And the post I'm reading is entitled, Does Isaiah 9:6 Affirm the Deity of Israel's Messiah? Posted on February 25 of 2022. And it's always nice to get more than one opinion. We read through Dr. Brown's version of the answer. We read through truthnet.org's version. I think it was truthnet. And tonight we're going to read, I believe, two, if I can get to both of them. We got Jonathan McClatchy, and we also have answeringislam.org, which is Sam Shamoun's answer. We're going to look at both of those tonight in the time. So let me just jump right into this and do a bunch of reading. All right. I'm jumping down into the article. I'm jumping down into the article. There's a lot of stuff that McClatchy brings to the table of discussion that you can go back and read on your own at the link at JonathanMcClatchy.com. Go back and read it. But for this particular study, we're only going to jump into the last part for the sake of time. Also, because we've already covered a lot of what McClatchy talks about. Here's what he has to say about the deity of Israel's Messiah. Having established that Isaiah 9:6 concerns the Messiah, we must now turn our attention to the question of whether it affirms his deity. As we have seen, Isaiah 9:6 confers upon the Messiah a fourfold title: Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Let's just look at these titles. He's going to jump first to the most provocative of the titles. He skips over Wonderful Counselor first, jumps straight into Mighty God. He's going to come back to the other three, by the way, too. Just he's putting them out of order, the way we'd read them in scriptures. So let's talk about the Mighty God. The most provocative of those titles is Mighty God. At first consideration, one might think that this ends the debate. However, Orthodox Jewish interpreters often point out that the title God can be used in some contexts of those who are not God. This is a point that's brought out correctly and rightly so by biblical Unitarians. It's one of their first points in their answer, as they say the word God, the word Elohim, as we're going to find out here, doesn't have to mean a deity. It's context dependent. It can mean a mere human being, or it can even mean a false god. So McClatchy says, for example, in Exodus 7:1, God says to Moses, quote, "See, I've made you God," the Hebrew word Elohim, "to Pharaoh," although some English translations add the word like. Before God, this is not present in the Hebrew text, right? I've made you like God. Psalm 8 verse 5 also uses the word Elohim in reference to angels or heavenly beings. We continue. A royal inauguration psalm refers to the Davidic king as God in Psalm 45, 6 through 7, which we know also shows up in the book of Hebrews and is quoted by the author of Hebrews. And McClatchy is surprisingly going to disagree with the traditional Christian Trinitarian understanding that this is a reference to calling Jesus God. But let's keep reading. Here's the quote from the book of Psalms, starting at verse 6. "Your throne, O God," the Hebrew word Elohim, "is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of uprightness." And then verse 7, "You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions." All right, listen to what McClatchy says here for a moment. This is actually in difference to what I believe the verse is saying. Although he has a point, it's just that he drives his point a little too farther than I prefer to drive mine. But I do recognize his point. I affirm it. But listen to this. Notice that the referent of the psalm is ascribed to the title of Elohim, yet distinguished from his God who has anointed him with the oil of gladness. Some Christian commentators have identified this as a reference to the Messiah. However, McClatchy says he believes this to be a mistake, since the context makes it clear that this psalm concerns a royal inauguration of a Davidic heir. Also, the psalm is introduced in verse 1 with a royal tribute, which reads, quote, "My heart overflows with a pleasing theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is like the pen of a ready scribe," end quote. This by itself is not fatal to a messianic interpretation, McClatchy says. However, verse 9 adds further clarity, quote, "Daughters of kings are among your ladies of honor. At your right hand stands the queen of gold, the queen in gold of Ophir," end quote. And so McClatchy rightfully brings out, right, this is in challenge to the Christian idea that this psalm is completely about Jesus and only about Jesus. And this is one of the reasons why the writer to the book of Hebrews quotes it. McClatchy says, yes, Jesus is divine. Yes, the writer to the book of Hebrews is referring to Messiah, but the entire psalm can't be about Jesus. Some parts of it are, some parts aren't. So we have a dual prophecy. We have near far going on. We have double duty being demonstrated in front of us, where we have two different people that the psalm could and must refer to. So McClatchy says, if this psalm concerns the Messiah, then who is the queen of whom the text also speaks, not to mention the daughters of kings who are his ladies of honor, right? We just have to look at the psalm and give credit for those authors, those Bible teachers who point out when we're having discussions like this, where we're like, we've got this near-far prophecy, these double-duty prophecies, where part of the prophecy is describing a human referent, someone that existed in Israel's day, a king that they could actually dialogue with face-to-face, a human being, or something to that effect. And then in the far future, the prophet was describing, many times maybe even unknown to him, was describing a coming figure, a Messiah, indeed someone who would transcend the earthly king and the office that is being described by the first referent. So we have double duty going on in the prophecy. It's describing two people. Like many of the prophecies are prophecies about King David, but they also describe King Messiah at the same time. They can overlap when we talk about application. But other times, like in Psalm 2 here, or Psalm 45, we have parts of the prophecy that can apply to an earthly king, and the other part of the prophecy can refer to King Messiah. And indeed, parts of the prophecy that refer to the earthly king must not refer to King Messiah because of the details that are given. So I'm showing you these aspects of prophecy because it's necessary for us to be able to properly interpret them. So let's continue with McClatchy. He says, it has been suggested that the wedding in Psalm 45 is intended to be a figurative description of the eschatological wedding banquet, with the queen being a metaphor for God's people and the bridesmaids representing foreign nations. And he says, while this is not impossible, it seems to me that the most straightforward reading is that the bride and bridesmaids are literal rather than figurative. Thus, it must be granted that the title Elohim, coming full circle back to the Isaiah 9 passage, the title Elohim carries a broader meaning than merely an alternative designation of Yahweh, though it, of course, can be and usually is used in this sense. The question then is what we can determine from the context about its meaning in Isaiah 9:6. So let's come back to Isaiah. In Isaiah 9:6, the complete phrase that is used is El Gibor. And so we're talking about the El part, which is a shortened name for God, for Elohim, and then the Gibor. This expression, McClatchy says, occurs 3 other times in the Hebrew Bible corpus, and in all 3 of those cases, it refers specifically to Yahweh. And here are the references. We've got Deuteronomy. These are the other 3, of course. Isaiah 9 is the 4th one. Deuteronomy 10:17, Jeremiah 32:18, and Isaiah 10:21 are the other 3, along with the Isaiah reference we're looking at now. So one of those references, McClatchy says, is in fact in the very next chapter of the book that we're in now. It follows our text. Let's read it. Quote, a remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God, El Gibor, or El Gibor, if you want to pronounce the Tzedre markings under that a little bit more accurately. El is how most people say it commonly, as in Elohim, El Gibor, but truly Ale, like the drink A-L-E, ale, or sick, like ailment, ale Gibor would be better. Isaiah 10:21 is that reference there. So McClatchy says that this tends to favor an interpretation of the same expression in Isaiah 9:6, like the verse that we're reading now, as likewise denoting divine status, right? Go back up there. When the verse says, a remnant will return to the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. There in Isaiah 10:21, the context very clearly seems to be pointing to, obviously, the divine figure known as God, the mighty God, the El Gibor, not some mighty hero in Israel's history. The remnant of Jacob is going to return to God, not to some mighty hero such as David or something like that. So that's why McClatchy says this tends to favor an interpretation of the same expression. However, and this is a very important however, he says a sample size of 3 is not sufficiently large to render this conclusion beyond all doubt, and so we must further supplement it with additional augmentation. He's just reminding us, don't cherry pick, don't build all your theology on 1 or 2 chair passages. It's better to locate your theology within a larger range of context, either by way of the book you're reading or by way of the section of history that is in focus, like in Israel's history, like the Old Testament, Tanakh, etc. Or you have to zoom out to the entire Bible and get the context from there. Either way, it's very good advice to bring in as much context as possible, which is what I've tried to do through the entire study, is look at the names of the child in Isaiah and ask, who is this child in the greater scope of Isaiah's description of this person that he is revealing to Israel through the Spirit of God? McClatchy continues, it should be noted here that it may be contended that an exception is found in Ezekiel 32:21, which reads, quote, the mighty chiefs, which is Ele Giborim, shall speak of them. So this is an exception, so just listen up. This verse uses the phrase Ele Giborim, which is sometimes claimed to be the same words used in Isaiah in the same order, but in the plural form and connected in a genitive relation, right? Literally, gods of mighty ones. When we say genitive, we're talking about like possession. Gods of mighty ones, or if we swap it around and use an apostrophe, we would say the mighty ones, gods. However, the word ele actually derives from the root word ayil, which can mean a ram or a leader / chief. meaning it's not even really the same root word. It's also noteworthy that the word ale occurs in the singular form 217 times in the biblical text, and always and without exception, according to McClatchy, denotes nothing less than absolute deity, though there is a handful of instances where it is used to refer to false gods, like Deuteronomy 32:12, Psalm 44:20, as well as 81:9, Isaiah 44 verse 10, as well as 45 verse 20, and Malachi 2:11. So even in those references where we have ale being without exception denoting nothing less than absolute deity, even in the case of false gods, we're still talking about deity. So we're not talking about human beings. Thus, McClatchy continues, if Isaiah 9:6 does not use the word ale to denote divine status, it would be the sole exception. Are you catching the import of what he's saying? Those out there, like Biblical Unitarian, remember, they want to say that mighty God, El Gibor, should be rendered mighty hero, as in not a divine figure, but a human figure, and merely human, nothing more. Although, remember, to their credit, Biblical Unitarian departs from Rabbinic Judaism in recognizing that the figure in the Bible known as the Messiah, according to Biblical Unitarian, this figure is Jesus. By comparison, Rabbinic Judaism rejects that. They do not choose to locate that messianic figure as Jesus, unless they're doing it in secret and not telling us about it. But the vocal proponents of Rabbinic Judaism are vehemently opposing the Christian notion that the Messiah in the Old Testament is Jesus. So Biblical Unitarian, you guys got it right if you're saying it's Messiah, but you got it wrong if you're saying that according to his name, El Gibor, he's merely human, because the data doesn't seem to add up. According to McClatchy's research here, which I've tried to back up as best as I can, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but according to my looking behind him and going behind him and following up on what his research indicates, seems to be solid that Isaiah 9:6 uses El Gibor in a divine sense, because all of the other uses of ale in the passages in question in the Old Testament are also of divine figures, right? All right, so let's keep going. Some have pointed out that the word Gibor is sometimes used as a noun, meaning hero or warrior, like Biblical Unitarian does. And thus the phrase El Gibor in Isaiah 9:6 could perhaps mean something like godlike warrior or something like that, mighty hero. On this view, the word ale would be taken adjectively rather than as a noun. So if Biblical Unitarian is going to say, oh, El Gibor means mighty hero, but even though the word ale normally means as a name, it's the name of a divine figure known as God, but since we're seeing it as an adjective in front of Gibor, that's why we're saying mighty hero. So McClatchy's entertaining that notion for a moment. There are many examples in the Hebrew Bible of the word ale being used with the following noun or adjective. So we'll give him that much. Hebrew scholar Alec Motyer comments, quote, with a following adjective, ale always retains its full status as a noun. For instance, Exodus 20 verse 5, Deuteronomy 7:9, and Deuteronomy 10:17. He further remarks, if ever ale is used adjectively, the phrase is never identical with Isaiah 9:6, and its meaning is never diluted into godlike. Whenever we find a construction identical with Isaiah 9:6, ale, then with a following adjective or noun, then ale is never adjectival, but is always the ruling noun, more closely defined by the additional word. So this is very important to listen to. Getting a little technical here as we're closing out this discussion. As quoted previously, this is McClatchy reminding us, the Targum of Jonathan, and it says quoted previously, we didn't read McClatchy's, but we have read about Targum Jonathan in previous studies, so just pretend that we read McClatchy's version. The Targum of Jonathan ben Uziel renders Isaiah 9:6 into Aramaic as, quote, the prophet said to the house of David, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and he has taken the law upon himself to keep it. His name is called from before him who is, now listen to this part about the names, from him who is wonderful in counsel, the mighty God who lives to eternity, the Messiah whose peace shall be great upon us in his days. So did you catch it? Did you catch the names of the child? Let me read it again. His name is called from before him who is wonderful in counsel, right? This part is ascribed to God. The mighty God who lives to eternity, that part is also ascribed to God. And then the Messiah whose peace shall be great upon us in his days, the kind of the everlasting Father, Prince of Peace part kind of conflated and combined and paraphrased by the Targum here. But notice the important part, all right? McClatchy's going to bring it out for us. This rendering avoids the implication of the child being afforded titles such as Mighty God and Father of Eternity. However, on this translation, Michael Brown remarks, the problem with this translation, and we read this before, when we read Dr. Brown's answer to this objection using it answering the Jewish objections to Jesus books. Brown remarked, the problem with this translation, aside from the fact that it is grammatically strained, is that almost all the names are heaped upon God, and only the last two are given to the Son, although it is the naming of this royal child that is central to the verse. How odd, right? This is Dr. Brown still speaking. Clearly, the names refer to the Son, not to the Lord who gave them. In other words, the Targumic rendering, McClatchy says, would be like saying, now listen to what Brown says, quote, this is Brown making a funny quote as if he is a Talmudic rabbi rendering the verse into his own understanding. So this is what Brown would have to say. Quote, and God, the great, glorious, holy, wonderful, eternal, unchangeable Redeemer and King and Lord, calls his name Joe. End quote. All right. So Brown continues. He says, there's no precedent or parallel to this anywhere in the Bible. And speaking of the Targum, there's no logical explanation for this rendering, nor is it even a natural grammatical rendering of the Hebrew. The characteristics of the royal child are central, highlighted here by his names, not the characteristics of the Lord. And the reason I wanted you to see part of that is because in the Targums, they don't find it necessary to strip the names of their divinity in order to prove the point that this is not a divine figure, this person that's to become this king in Israel's history. Instead, they take those titles and they give them their full weight of deity, right? El Gibor. They simply change the referent. Instead of referring to the son, the Targumists believe that it's referring to God himself. So that's what Dr. Brown's bringing up. Let's finish McClatchy's blog here. Everlasting Father. The child is also identified by the title Everlasting Father, which is Avi Ad, which may be translated as a genitive phrase, Father of Eternity, right? Eternity's Father, if you want to use the genitive using the apostrophe S that you're used to reading in many Bibles, or reading, not many Bibles, I'm sorry, if you're used to the genitive construction as apostrophe S, that's what it means. But otherwise, it's we use the noun of noun construction that tells us that it's genitive. So Avi Ad in the Hebrew text stands in a genitive relation to Ad. So Avi Ad, that's how we recognize it. Hans Wildeberger concurs with this rendering. Avi Ad can only mean Father of Eternity. That's what he believes as well. This translation, now notice, Father of Eternity, not Father of the coming age like REV says, meaning they're adding words paraphrastically to what the Hebrew literally just simply says, Father of Eternity. There's not an extra word, coming eternity or coming age, rendering the word Ad there. Avi is the father part. We're used to hearing Av as in Abba, right, from the Greek, Abba, father, or daddy is what we render it in English sometimes. So Av, Abba, that's the Av part. Avi is my, literally my father. And then the, since it's a genitive construct, then we have the Ad being eternity, my father of eternity, or my father's, the eternity of my father, something to that effect.